was published a meta-analysis, Wu and colleagues, that totaled over 2,000 tragically completed suicides and 5,000 matched controls. And there was a 62% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when there was a strong spiritual life. And that went up to 82% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when spiritual life is shared. Shared as in that Yom Kippur service. Shared in the Sangha, the Minyan, the fellowship. It could be the Army Squad. And spiritual life is shared. So if I said, hey, we're in a pandemic, and there's something that's going to protect the students here on campus at UCLA 4/5 against the pandemic. I mean, that's an extraordinary protective benefit. And it's this little pill. Who wouldn't throw that back? And who wouldn't send that to their kids from all over the world? This is our birthright. And the realization of who we are and how we're built is our strongest fortification against this pandemic of suicide.
Our guest today is Dr. Lisa Miller. She's a professor of psychology at Columbia. She's the founder of the Mind and Body Institute and also the author of the bestseller, The Awakened Brain. I also have on Dr. Kevin Bickart, who is a neurobehavioral neurologist here at UCLA. And our topic today is the essential nature of spirituality to the human condition. We talk all things spirituality, how it relates to mental health, how it relates to resiliency, how it relates to our sense of purpose. I had a fantastic time, got a lot out of it. Hope you guys do too. But most importantly, stay safe, be well. Let's start off the podcast with a quote from what I just came to learn is one of our favorite poets, mutually.
Yes.
So it's from Rumi. It's a quote from Rumi. It says, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean and a drop."
Magnificent.
I think it's magnificent too. And I think it really applies to a lot about what we're going to talk about today, spirituality, and specifically how it relates to mental health, mental illness, as well as overall well-being, especially in a state and a society now that I think there's a huge lack of all those things. So thanks for joining.
I'm so grateful to be here, and thank you for the honor of being invited.
Yeah. And Dr. Bickart, thank you so much for joining too.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
That quote made me think of things I've heard you say, a point and a wave. It couldn't have been teed up better.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'd like to think that's why I did it, but you know, I just like Rumi, so that's why I chose that quote.
The unit of reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll dig in.
We'll dig.
So let's start digging.
Great.
And let's talk about, I think a great place to start, you wrote the book, The Awakened Brain. So why don't we start with that? Pretty basic, but foundational. What is the awakened brain?
So I wrote the book, The Awakened Brain, to summarize what's been 25 years of research of our lab and fellow labs around the country on spirituality, its biological correlates, and its impact on our health, our wellness, our thriving. The Awakened Brain, was 30 years in the making. It started with my experience as a young intern on a New York City hospital inpatient unit, where I saw there were a great number of patients who simply were not getting better. And there were very capable, well-trained, caring mental health providers, but the way in which we'd all been trained, the dominant models at the time, had yet to embrace spiritual life. And, I looked at these files. This was pre-digital, and some of them were 3 inches thick, and some of them were 6 inches thick, and some of them were so big that a second file had been started. I mean, this was a revolving door. And I thought, the hardcore reality is that in the past 6 months, I've seen 3 or 4 readmissions of the same patients. Something isn't working.
Yeah.
And then the patients started telling their own stories. And they would say things like, "Dr. Miller, can you come here?" And I'd say, "Sure," step outside my office. No, here. Here meant down the hall, into the kitchen, through the back of the kitchen to the pantry, and standing by literally the dishes and the pots and pans, "Dr. Miller." So this was considered forbidden, right? Will you pray with me? And this happened to be someone of a different faith tradition than my own. It was completely irrelevant to this patient. She wanted someone to be with her as she connected with who I call God, right? And she felt that to pray together was more significant and sacred than to be alone in prayer.
Why you? Why do you think they came to you? There's a lot of interns, there's a lot of doctors. Why you?
No one's ever asked that. What an interesting question. I guess they knew I was interested. And maybe the word got out that, hey, that young doctor, she sees what we want to share.
So you had expressed interest regarding spirituality and its necessity, specifically in the context of mental illness before?
Oh, so that's actually, you're a good investigative journalist. Because indeed, about a month earlier, this is New York City, and it was the fall. It was the time for the Jewish high holidays, and all of the clergy and doctors were leaving. One of the patients in our community meeting raised their hand and said, what will we be doing for the high holidays? What are we going to do for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, forgiveness? And the person who ran the unit, felt badly and sort of shifted his weight and said, there's nothing planned. And this patient, who was bipolar and struggling to contain himself, erupted in pain. It was excruciating that there wouldn't be a Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. Got up and he walked out of the meeting, and it was stone silent. And I shot my eyes across the room, and there was a woman who had recurrent major depression, so full of shame, so full of, her body was an apology, so full of a felt sense of unworthiness. And she just slumped. And I thought, this isn't right. So I approached the unit chief and I said, I'm not a rabbi, but I can see that perhaps we could facilitate a Yom Kippur service here. So I dusted off my grandmother's prayer book that I'd read for 30 years, and I figured I can join and help lead. And when I showed up on Yom Kippur, the place was pretty quiet, right? All of the patients who were to participate in the service had come into the kitchen with the fluorescent lights blaring on our sanctuary, right? And were seated in beautiful clothes. They'd asked that their relatives bring them beautiful clothes, not their hospital gurneys. By their side were attendants. And as we started, suddenly I saw a health. I saw a deep engagement in the prayers that they had themselves said for decades. Every Yom Kippur we say the same prayers. And the gentleman, the very same gentleman who'd exploded in pain that there was not to have been a Yom Kippur service, was the one holding the rhythm. Jews say davening, moving his body to the prayers and holding the cadence for all of us. He was completely intact. He was effectively leading us in prayer. And the slumped woman was sitting upright. And when it was time for sharing, she said, I'd always known that on Yom Kippur I could ask for forgiveness. But sitting here with you all, see, in spiritual community, I see that I can be forgiven. So that ceremony said to me that there was a re-enlivening impact. There was a rekindling of the flame that came through spiritual life, particularly when spiritual life was shared, that was completely absent in mental health at the time, in mental health treatment at the time. And a mental health field minus the spiritual heart made no sense. So that became my life's work, was to understand through treatment, through the lens of clinical science, through outcome studies, through any lens I could get my hand on, MRI studies, genotyping studies, long-term clinical course studies, high-risk studies, any lens I could get my hand on, the centrality of spirituality and resilience and renewal.
Yeah. So I think it's important to define it. I mean, you've been asked this plenty of times, but I think for our audience it's important, right? What spirituality actually is to you.
So scientists do not define spirituality all told in a theological sense or a cosmological sense, but we are good at identifying threads of lived human spiritual life that can be highly impactful, tidal wave changing actually onto the rest of our lives. And so too, we can identify threads of lived human spiritual life, which through twin studies, we can track the origin, the extent to which there may be an innate or an environmental component. So the two threads now, 25 years later, where we have tremendous evidence of a life-changing impact, is to have a direct transcendent relationship, whether your word is God, Allah, Jesus, Hashem, the universe, and to feel that great love in our relationships with one another, love of neighbor. Both are forms of relational spirituality, and both engage some of the same circuits in our brain.
Now, you also mentioned that we're born innately. So we're born with the capacity, not even the capacity, but rather the need for spiritual engagement. Right?
We are hardwired. So
right. Hardwired.
A twin study can look at the relative similarities and differences amongst us as humanity, or more specifically within a study sample, and parcel out the extent to which the variance, the differences between us, are attributed to broad heritability, which is our genes plus epigenesis, right? Or environment, which is both our unique environment and our shared environment. So by way of comparison, temperament, whether we are more outgoing or more introverted, whether we are high-strung or more laid back, that's about half environmentally determined, half innate. So if you think of little babies that you've known, they don't come with the same temperament, right? I have 3 children, and the center child slept through the night at 18 months. She's the artist. 18 months. So for 18 months, I got up, walked across the house, and soothed the baby. And that, of course, was environment. So that little baby is 21, and she sleeps through the night, and she's allowed me to share she's a bit anxious. So environment has a very 50%, meaningful impact, but our temperament is also very much hardwired, half and half. So you smart doctors, you were born smart. You became doctors, but you were born smart. IQ is 60% innate.
Yeah, I do wonder, because you've stated that children are born with a spiritual understanding, but secondary to socialization, basically that goes away.
Yes.
But you said that, so if they're not socialized, then they'll just continue kind of being inherently spiritual, right?
So by way of comparison, our innate capacity for spiritual life, and more specifically, this thread of lived human spiritual life through which we experience a transcendent relationship, God, Hashem, Allah, right, the universe, and the presence of that love towards one another, our relational spiritual capacity is 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed, which means our parents and grandparents and community and our pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, and our 10,000 exchanges by the locker all weigh in relationally to shape the spiritual core. So the innately spiritual child has a capacity that can be fortified and enriched and is inherently a spiritual child. But with a very empty 2/3 embrace, there can be an atrophy, if you will, of the spiritual core. And that's, I think, the source of the crisis in our current culture. That's why, in my view, based on 25 years of data, published peer-reviewed data, many labs, many different points of view, it is absolutely the case that a strong spiritual core is protective against the diseases of despair.
So you've mentioned a bunch of published data. Can you share with us just your favorite bits of scientific literature and data that points towards the fact that spirituality is just essential?
Yes.
To us
well,
as
I
humans?
think the crisis, right, the undeniable crisis,
Right.
the pandemic for Gen Z is the pandemic of suicide. So the rate of death by suicide rivals the rate of death by auto accident in high school. It's the #1 killer of youth. And that's pushing into middle school. So it is not by cancer or COVID or even, the tragic school shootings that our young people are most at risk, it is by taking their own life. Before the absolute peak of this crisis in 2015, there was published a meta-analysis, Wu and colleagues, that totaled over 2,000 tragically completed suicides and 5,000 matched controls. And there was a 62% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when there was a strong spiritual life. And that went up to 82% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when spiritual life is shared as in that Yom Kippur service, shared in the Sangha, the Minyan, the fellowship. It could be the Army Squad. And spiritual life is shared. So if I said, hey, we're in a pandemic, and there's something that's going to protect the students here on campus at UCLA 4/5 against the pandemic. I mean, that's an extraordinary protective benefit. And it's this little pill. Who wouldn't throw that back? Yeah. And who wouldn't send that to their kids from all over the world? Mm-hmm. This is our birthright. And the realization of who we are and how we're built is our strongest fortification against this pandemic of suicide.
Yeah. 80% or 82% is significant and striking. But
it's staggering.
It's pretty incredible. And
it's not 100%, right? There are spiritual people who do take their life, but it's the best thing we have.
Right. And we can talk about that, like cults and things like that end up committing suicide, as a collective. Certainly there's a spiritual element to that. We can talk about that a little bit later, but I want to stay on par with the 82% improvement or avoidance of suicide. I wonder, coming from me, I'm a clinician, some research, but Dr. Bickart, he's heavy into research, so I want to hear what he thinks about something that has a 82% protective percentage against suicide. What do you think about that?
Staggering is an easy word to describe it. Where my mind was going when we were talking about the stats and numbers, and I dug into the book and watched a bunch of interviews, and I'm a believer. I think that being connected to a higher power, being connected to other people that are participating is a critical piece of resilience. I learned this from my father and mother, but also when I began doing research, I was reading Dennis Charney, who's at Mount Sinai. He was a resilience researcher, studied veterans back from Vietnam, and tried to distinguish those who went on to develop PTSD and those who didn't, and differentiate them on a number of psychological factors as well as biological and neurological, and found that several of the things in the psychological domain that were protective were beliefs, perceptions, and the one that fits this storyline is the belief in higher power. But there was also a belief that every traumatic experience is an obstacle. It's an opportunity, not an obstacle. Belief in control over one's environment, belief in the support of others, and so on. So having that set of beliefs was protective. So that got me right in the beginning of my MD PhD interested in the believing brain, and so that's something I studied and thought a lot about. So I'm really on the same page as you in many ways. I wonder, when we talk about the 1/3 innate versus 2/3 environmental, does that mean, I just get confused in the kind of ways of thinking about this, that some people are born not with some spiritual tendency, or everyone you think is born with some spiritual tendency, and then, as Daniel said, it's for some of us washed and some of us encouraged?
So thank you. We are all born with this. There is a strong heritable piece in all of us. Mm-hmm. Every human being on earth is born a spiritual child. Mm-hmm. And there's also human variability, as there is in any innate capacity. Mm-hmm. So every one of us is a naturally spiritual being, and there can be differences in what channel it comes on. Some people are more kinesthetic and they feel things. Some people are more driven by, study and logic about this. But there's a seat of perception through which we feel and know a transcendent presence. And that is our birthright, every one of us. What we call it, the 2/3 embrace, how we practice, whether it's prayer, meditation, or spiritual mind-body work, the way in is found all around the world, but the beautiful pluralism is, of course, in the 2/3 of the environmental embrace, how it is cultivated.
My dad would say something to the effect of remembering your childhood, thinking that, I think I've heard you say something about children come in knowing and having an awareness that there is a connection between all people and where they came from, and reconnecting with that, and he talks about it in the context of education, brings you to the table with children who need that. And so hearing him talk about that, and you saying that it's innate and we all come with that capacity, and slowly, just as a matter of development, a matter of, kind of mixing it up with all these other kids and bullies and technologies and other things, that it probably gets diluted for a lot of us.
And still, as parents and educators, we can choose to step in and really engage the spiritual core.
Yeah.
When the child comes and says something that they feel God's presence, or they feel the presence of Allah, or they feel some deep sense of spirit into nature, we can say, wow, tell me what that feels like. I feel that too. And tell our own stories. I think as parents, we're enormously impactful on the formation of the core. Yeah. And what we've seen over several studies, that there's two major components to how we support our children's spiritual core. And the first is that we live out the spiritual values and spiritual truth. Pull over and help the homeless guy, forgive someone who's done something harmful to you and your family. It doesn't mean you re-expose yourself. Forgive them. Sure. Whatever spiritual values you walk, your children will watch like a hawk. So when we walk the walk, our children learn that the spiritual life is real, and this is how we enact it. The second equally impactful piece is that we talk the walk, that we explain why is it that we've pulled over, because me and the homeless guy, we're equal, right? We're all equal before who I call God. This is like rays of a sun. We are from the same source of life. This is our brother, our sister. Narrate. And when we talk the walk and walk the walk, it says to our children, the spiritual realm is real. We talk about that here. And here's how we do it. And it becomes their go-to bedrock in a world that, again, as you say, so rightly, may not have ever called attention to the most profound dimension of our existence.
No.
Okay?
One of the stats, I think, it was your interview with Kaufman. That's his last name, right? The Psychology podcast. He seems to have some similar lineage with Martin Seligman and creativity. But was that, like IQ, the amount of variability explained by genetics increases with age? And it's not something I've ever really thought about, but it sounds like there's been studies since that twin study to suggest that spirituality, the amount of variability in that, and who becomes spiritual, it also increases with age in terms of how much is explained by genetics.
So beautiful, close read. See, thank you for bringing your MD, PhD to the reference section. It's beautiful. Like any innate human capacity, there is an arc of growth. So just as we shoot up between 9th grade and 10th grade and everybody comes back looking taller, or at midlife, suddenly I had to wear glasses. I couldn't believe it. Within 2 months, I needed glasses to read. There's a biological clock. And when it comes to the innate capacity for relational transcendence, that hardwired capacity has a surge. There are 3 bridges in life, and they're hardwired. The first is coming of age with puberty and emerging adulthood. The second is at midlife, and the third is at elderhood. And in each of these phases, there is a transformation. Ready or not, whether or not anyone tells us it's coming, there's a surge. A biological clock moves us into an expanded capacity for spiritual life, which can feel like a half-empty glass of spirituality. It, phenomenologically, in a young adult, you know this as leaders on campuses. What is my purpose? And I don't mean, am I going to be a lawyer or doctor? I mean my ultimate purpose with relation to life itself, ultimate reality. What is the nature of ultimate reality? And with the nagging of the head, comes a very strong hunger of the heart for the numinous, for the transcendent, for love. This is a quest. It is a hardwired thrust, a surge. It is unavoidable. And in fact, in our hundreds of interviews of teens, we often hear, it's when I don't think about it that I get more depressed. It's an imperative. This is the most important work we do. College is a time for the formation of the spiritual core.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's these bridging moments where spirituality is needed due to the necessary growth of spirituality, that if it's not met, how does that lead to depression? Is it, maladaptive strategies that end up, putting us in a certain state of mental illness?
So the surge, the hunger, has an existential quality, a yearning. And I can tell you a story when I was 19, what it felt like. And that is a developmental depression. That is a knock at the door for spiritual awakening. And I'm not against medication at all, but medication alone is insufficient to address a developmental depression for its formative, really the most important work. This is the opportunity of that young adult's lifetime to form the foundation of the rest of his or her, their life. So when I was 19, I had always, I went off to college. I'd always felt very close to God. My family was spiritual and religious. My mother would cry with an authentic sense of transcendence and love when she prayed. When she looked at my brother and I, her children, she'd say, "Thank you, God. Thank you, God. No human could make this." It was very clear to me that the spiritual realm is real. We talk about it here, and this is how we walk it. So I went off to college, and I would say that in the air and water of my experience, and it's still the case in many universities, there was a radical materialism. It's only real if you can touch it. It's only real if it can be seen or engaged by the five senses. And with that latent radical materialism was really a disavowal of a transcendent reality, a sacredness written into life. In fact, I would say that many of my classes assumed that to eviscerate all inherent meaning in life was somehow more skeptical or rigorous. But it was actually thrown out as the a priori assumption. There was nothing examined or rigorous about it. And that's a very empty way to be. And I started noticing that no one around me believed in God, or if they did, they didn't feel free to talk about it. And there certainly was no great American pluralism, where you tell me about Diwali or Ramadan or Christmas, and I tell you about Muhammad. No beautiful pluralism. It was stone silent, and maybe a friend would whisper about their own spiritual or religious life. So, when crisis came, in my case, I was 19, and I'd fallen in love. I fell in love. And I thought, he's perfect. He's so interesting, and he's so smart, and he's so handsome, and we're going to get married. So in love. And after 3 months, he said, "I love you." And I thought, "You love me?" And then after 5 months, he broke up with me. And I thought, "But you said you loved me." My mother loves me, and she still loves me. How could you? And that sent me into a tailspin, because love for the first time in my life was impermanent. Love could break. Yeah. And I thought, well, wait a minute. That became an existential thorn.
It's the red door right there.
Yes. Yes. If love can break and love isn't permanent, then are we permanent?
So developmental depression.
Yeah. That's the typical trigger. Heartbreak.
But let's try to quantify it, right? What percentage of this kind of age range or this demographic of folks suffering with depression is that, a 30% developmental depression, 50%, 100%?
Well, we looked at 5,500 college students from many different campuses and all different types of schools. And it turned out that about 2/3, 60 to 60, about 2/3 of depressions were developmental depressions and had a different symptom cluster. Much more anhedonia and cognitive, and much less vegetative, and different paths of recovery. So, it's so interesting that in our data set, 2/3 of college students who presented as depressed actually had a developmental depression. because without even citing that study, when I've been out on the road simply presenting, the basic science on spirituality and its protective benefits, college counselors come up to me and say, about 2/3 of my caseload, it's not really DSM. You're sort of reaching for this. It's not really a medical illness. It's this developmental depression. It's immediately resonant with those who work deeply with college students. And I've worked extensively with the U.S. military. And the chief of behavioral health said, about 2/3 of our cases are not DSM. They're developmental depression. And they now are invited to consider seeing a universally trained chaplain who listens for the whisper of spirit or God in their heart, in their language. Because, frankly, given the crisis, the logjam, there's a line very long outside the door of most mental health clinics, and most people can't get an appointment when they need it. And the chief of behavioral health, Sam Preston, at the time said, we need these seats. And it was such a wise statement for first breaks and bipolar. And he said, when this is coming of age, it's written up as adult adjustment disorder. It's developmental depression, the emergence of the deep core. That's the foundation for the rest of these people's lives.
I did want to ask, speaking about college, and I love the lineage stories, for folks who go into research about their mothers and fathers of their mentorship through their research tracks and things. And I was reading that you worked with Martin Seligman on these long walks, and there's lots of discovery there. And I find similarities between his and other positive psychology people at the time, Csikszentmihalyi, and then go back to Maslow and things like that. I just want maybe a little storyline or narrative from your experiences. Did you differentiate yourself from them? Was this kind of something that they reinforced? Did you speak about the spiritual brain with them?
So Marty Seligman is forever my beloved mentor. He was really my role model of how to mentor a graduate student. We would walk for hours and talk about ideas. He comes to psychology through a strong philosophical point of view. And much of positive psychology as character strengths and virtues is actually based on Aristotelian vision of virtue. So, and he was indeed a philosophy major in his undergraduate. So we would walk for hours, Marty and I, exploring these ideas. And I think the most profound understanding that Marty imparted on me is that our deep seat of perception can be cultivated and refined, that we are the observing eye over our inner life, that we are chairman of the board over the landscape.
It's in the eye of the beholder.
And that we can make changes. So Marty Seligman's work on the side that was about prevention against depression was about explanatory style, how we can retell our experience. And on the side that was about positive psychology was about cultivating our inherent virtues. So I am so grateful to Marty for a deep understanding that we can cultivate our deep way of seeing and being in the world. Where Marty, with his generous heart, supported me in my own vision, and he did not happen to agree, was that even back then, in the mid-90s, I perceived, and this was even before the inpatient unit, that there was a transcendent capacity in us that perceived something real and that shifted all other understandings of our lives, that it was so very central, our capacity to see the spiritual realm in life, that all else would be told different from that stance. At the time, he was so encouraging. He said, give it a name. And we called it the Olympian state, the view from the top of the mountain. And he must have so generously spent 100 hours with me as I explained to him how, from the Olympian point of view, life was different than how much of cognitive therapy at that time understood the rearrangement of meaning through debate and argument within ourselves, something that we called actually...
Dissonance.
Yeah, and we called that more Apollonian. So, he was very encouraging. To this day, when I started the APA journal Spirituality in Clinical Practice, and I invited him to write an article for our first issue, and he wrote, from his point of view. And to this day, we have different points of view. It's wonderful to love your academic father or mother so much and still not to be identical twins. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So back to the developmental depression.
Yes.
So it seems like these bridges or these crossroads that people come to secondary to either just natural development or maybe, a tragic or stressful event.
As the precipitant. Yeah.
As a precipitant. Basically, kind of, you can either go the spiritual route, right? Which, you're saying is protective against potentially developing any sort of mental illness secondary to that event.
Once it's formed, but it's a rough road to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, the other path, which is, not a good one. And it ends up leading you to, maladaptive strategies and maybe depression or any other mental illness. I wonder what you think the factors relating to taking one path versus the other. Are there specific factors relating to that? Certainly, I'm sure a history of spirituality is one factor, but are you able to identify any others?
Certainly a history is important. If there's a name for this deep source of life, if I as a child learned how to pray or meditate and access the presence of who I call God, spirit, force, source, that is very, very helpful. If in the first 15 years of life we prepare our children as parents and as educators to access through their natural spirituality, the transcendent presence, the transcendent reality, then they have so much more to draw on when they face developmental depression. And still, this is our birthright, and it can be a time of deep spiritual awakening, even if we haven't been given those gifts of language and practice and a roadmap of the spiritual reality. We can encounter a pastor, priest, imam, counselor, coach, teacher, doctor, who walks the walk and talks the walk, who shares in an authentic first-person voice of their spiritual path, tells us a story, the generous, precious gift of our life experience. When I was in college, I hit a really rough patch, and I didn't know if God was real, and I didn't know if life had meaning. And when I went to religious studies and philosophy, all I heard was that it's a big, empty, random universe. And yet, I had a breakthrough, and it went like this. So that type of sharing, that's real mentorship. I call those people trail angels. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think truth is essential to spirituality?
Say more.
Does it matter what the truth is to someone's spirituality and to the specific topic that we're referring to now being protective against mental health or mental illness?
Well, I think that as parents, as grandparents, as mentors, that we are authentic and speak the truth as we've lived it is extremely important. Because with this phase of booting up, the teen is exquisitely sensitive to truth. So there's nothing more deauthorizing of a parent or of a faith leader than hypocrisy. And the teen smells it, and is so quick to call it out. Why is it at our house of worship that they don't have the teachers and sages at the door? They have the people who gave money, right? Calling it out.
I think also there's a difference between spiritual beliefs and spiritual practices. Right? Do you think they're mutually beneficial? Do you think one is more important than the other? What are your thoughts on that?
So I tend to think in terms of spiritual perception more than belief. I think this innate capacity to perceive a transcendent relationship is our seat of perception, less than a belief. A belief I think of as the language that might be given to it or the narrative around it, but our birthright is a direct hit. So, for instance, this weekend I was meeting with musicians, and I said, who here in this room full of musicians would say that your most important contribution of all the beautiful work you've done came through a direct hit, a mystical experience, a dream, a synchronicity, something that was a direct touch from the transcendent? And the majority of musicians raised their hand. That's true, it turns out, for us scientists, too. It turns out that over 2/3 of scientists, Scott Richards published this over 15 years ago, say their most important contribution came through an inspired experience, a dream, a mystical experience that they attribute to the transcendent. Now, the conduct of the study, the rollout, is very rigorous and relies on the standard scientific method, and it's logic and empiricism. And in our inner table of human knowing, we all have intuitives and mystics who are just as important in discovery and in navigating both our work and our precious lives.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well,
I think I would chalk that up to belief.
Say more.
I don't know. I mean, certainly, we could talk circles about, what is truth in the sense of like what someone's experience is. Is it actual truth, or is it the belief, the concrete, all-in belief on something, right? I'm sure there's a difference between those two things, or maybe not, and there doesn't have to be, right? But nonetheless, it drove them to produce one of their greatest works.
So I often say to people, the proof is in the pudding. If you perceive that through your awakened brain, you are loved and held, you are guided, and you are never alone, and you follow that thread of life, whether it's synchronicity or a deep knowing, and it bears fruit, right? Not necessarily what you wanted, but something more true or right for you, better for you. There's over time, I think the proof's in the pudding. Can we do a practice?
Sure. We were waiting for you to say that.
Yeah? Good.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we start with Road of Life because we're talking about that, or shall we start with counsel?
You guide us. You tell us what to start with.
May we start? Okay. I think your interesting question about belief versus perception is very rich for people to explore.
Okay.
So may I offer this as an opportunity to explore their seat of perception?
I'd love to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So this is a practice I always think my teacher that was given to me, and I've given to students and those with whom I work. It was developed by the late Dr. Gary Weaver in people who had felt crossed or betrayed and had spiritual injury. So moral injury is when the world as we know it doesn't hold. Spiritual injury is when we feel cut off from our higher power, or unworthy before our higher power, or angry because the person carrying the torch didn't walk the walk. Right? And this was a way that he helped people get back to their deep birthright. Good?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. Take 5 breaths. Clear out your inner space. I invite you in your inner chamber to set before you a table. This is your table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is so much more than anything that you may have or not have, anything you've done or not done, your true eternal higher self, and ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, however you know, whatever word is yours, your higher power, and ask if they love you. And now with all of those people sitting here right now, What do they need to share? What do they need to tell you now? What do they need to share? What do you need to know? And when you're ready, I invite you back. This is your counsel, and they're always there for you. Who shows up may change depending on where we are in our road of life, and we can ask what's on our heart at the time.
Mm-hmm.
How'd you experience that?
Specifically, or just generally?
Whatever you might share.
Yeah, it was excellent. I've never done that before. Yeah, I knew exactly who I wanted at the table. And they said something that I've been thinking a lot about in regards as to how I'm supposed to move forward. And I knew they were right just because it's kind of been sitting there for a while. But, you know, yeah, glad I did that.
I'm grateful.
Yeah.
How'd you experience that?
I think the same. You know, what I always grapple with is the things I'm thinking and the things that I'm perceiving. You know, in this, I get confused what the inner voice is, you know, and I think there was a time where I blocked it out, you know, i.e. dissertation mode, where I had to force myself into a state of mind and a practice that I think in some ways, or at least I perceived at the time, required me to ignore some inner voices. And I pushed forward knowing the risk that I might lose sight and lose touch of that inner voice. And then I think over time I've been asking myself that question ever since. It's like, when am I just making up ideas and going with them? These are good logical decisions. And when is it my higher self? When is it more of a wisdom that I'm following? So I haven't stopped. I think the message I got was slow. Then there was an expletive, down. You know, just because life, 3 kids, work, research, it's a busy time. And so I don't really know how to do that yet. But I'm hoping, as I was saying before the podcast started, that, you know, with the development of the family and us becoming a little bit more free, we can.
Yeah, I got slow too. I got slowed down too.
Did I say that to you?
No, you didn't whisper it. But that I got that too when I was doing that. Not you know, with the expletive, but you know, I think the general sense, I also got that message too, which is interesting.
Well, so those very generous stories, I think, are helpful to a lot of people because we are acculturated to go hard. I mean, here you're on an outstanding campus. There's thousands of students who are acculturated to go hard and put the inner life on the back burner. It's certainly in the air and water of our culture. Outcome, outcome, outcome. That, you know, it is important to build. These are building years, right? But the culture says to the exclusion, put everything on the back burner. You know, what you're calling dissertation. But how many people have felt that? Right? And yet, when we do slow down and when we do start listening to our counsel, those who truly have our best interest in mind, our higher self, our higher power, it is always there for us. No one can ever take it away. And we can, through listening, cultivate our attunement, hear it more clearly. So it is never lost. It is never damaged. It is always there. We can always get back to the voice of our natural, of our counsel, our natural transcendent awareness.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Can I go back to the developmental depression piece, because I wanted to just a phenomenon that I see in society and our culture that I think might tie into this. I wanted to get your thoughts on it. It's especially in this age demographic, there's like idolization of people, right? Especially in this kind of like age demographic that you describe as like, this is where the moment where you have that demand for spiritual growth, and if you don't meet it, then potentially there's adverse consequences like depression and whatnot. And in that same age demographic, we do see a lot of this like idolization of like celebrities, athletes and different things like that. People, things, right? I wonder if maybe
what a great word, people things.
People things.
Yes.
It was supposed to be people, things, but sure, people things too. Yeah. But I do wonder if that's like an attempt to substitute and fill that spiritual growth need, not necessarily through spirituality, but through idolization of these things. What do you think?
I think that's very wise, that there is a hunger for ultimate significance, and it's a hunger of the heart to feel it, and there's a hunger of the head to understand it and join it. And without guidance on the spiritual path, without support, we turn to a broad host of things. I mean, first of all, we are seeking spiritual guides. We can turn to bad actors. This is how people are brought into cults. This is how our people are brought into extremist groups, whatever that flavor may be, right? We are looking for spiritual mentors. We are looking for truth. And when we don't have support in seeking that, the sort of counterfeit gold, right, can look very shiny. And whether that's money or fame or those who seem to have it rubbing up against them, that's never going to fill the hole. But it's this sort of flight to, the epidemic in our culture on axis 1, episodic distress is suicide and depression. On axis 2, characterologically, is narcissism. We are absolutely indoctrinated into a culture of measurement. Who's bigger, who's better, who's got more, right? And that notion that everyone's going to be lined up in a straight line and measured it's taught. When I was a kid, we would get graded and they would literally list every member of the student body and the grade they got, right? So it was very clear of who's first, second, third on down the line. That notion of radical, incessant measurement creates an assumptive world of narcissism. Am I big enough? Am I good enough? Well, I don't feel that today because I'm actually feeling existential hollow. I'm actually feeling a call to go inward. But in this narcissistic culture, I think, no, I don't feel good. I'm not good enough. I kind of feel odd. I kind of feel that I don't meet the mark. But look who does on social media. They have 40 times more followers or 40 times more money or 40 times more fame. So it's very counterfeit. And I like your word, idolatry, because it's actually taking as an object. Right. Something that's going to fill the hole, and of course it won't.
Yeah, I do want to make sure I hit this topic, and I'd love your input on this. Is this what you're describing, spirituality, the science behind it, the neuroscience behind it, the importance of this specifically for mental health outcomes, the unmeasurable sense of the intervention of spirituality, where you can't even describe it. Like, you can't even describe what it is. You can, like you said, you can only measure spirituality tendencies in people. Lived human spirituality. Sorry.
Yeah, that was right. We're on the same page.
Okay. All right, but it seems like it just butts heads with science.
Science can create a whole panoply of studies that together we can look at in aggregate and say, wow, okay, we know that a strong spiritual core is 4/5 protective against suicide. It's also 4/5 protective going through the window of risk against addiction, the trailhead of lifetime course. We can track neural correlates. We can, for instance, when it comes to developmental depression, look at people who have recovered from depression through a deepening of spiritual life, who have walked through developmental depression in the years of 16 through 26, ages 16 through 26, and say that, hey, how do they look different? And it turns out that people who have recovered from major depression through a strengthening of personal spirituality showed cortical thickness across regions of the parietal, precuneus, and occipital. Right. So, okay, we sent that off to JAMA Psychiatry, and what came back was, wow, interesting, we want you to run a follow-up analysis. How is a thick cortex across the regions of the awakened brain today predictive of how someone might be doing a year from now? And it turned out the cortical thickness across the regions of the awakened brain was prospectively protective against the level of depressive symptoms 1 year out. So there's some evidence that spiritual life that is strengthened and realized through despair, once set up, becomes a go-to place and is neuroprotective against depression down the road. That doesn't mean we never get depressed. It means that there's a spiritual response to suffering, and that our seat of perception and reflection is strengthened.
Yeah. You described our borderline obsession with the material, right? Not also materialism, but just the material, being able to, here it is, I can touch it, I can manipulate it, and therefore, I know that this is real.
Yes.
I always thought that came from science. That was something that just science, it was really super important to science, and then it got extrapolated out to all sorts of elements of education. So because you mentioned it before, it's like this is kind of what butts heads with spirituality, is the fact that we can't do that.
So much is that in our culture that I think many people most equate science with radical materialism. But it turns out that science is a method. It's a method, and we can chart data points and then interpret what they mean, right? It is a lens, whether it's an MRI study or a genotyping study or an epidemiological study. Science is a lens. The interpretation of radical materialism, that it is only real if we can touch it, that there is no, when we showed the regions of cortical thickness associated with sustained spiritual life, there were people who said, oh, so the brain makes that up, right? There's just a hard stop, an absolute unwillingness to explore the range of possibility of a statement of the nature of reality, the ontology, the nature of reality other than only materialism. Well, that is not scientific. That is an assumption of materialism that is in the scientists. It is in the vogue, it is in the cultural moment of the scientists. And I actually think that it's part of an evisceration of meaning and despair that may have fallen out of World War II.
Interesting. Let me get your thoughts on that, buddy.
Well, I think that what I always have a challenge with when we talk about, the unquantifiable is you can never really dispute an interpretation. It's in the eyes of the beholder. I can interpret one finding one way, and you get 75 tweets going the other way, and so it's impossible to come together on an interpretation of quantifiable things in science. So what I always wonder when I read spiritual science or scientific evidence of spirituality is, what are the critics saying? It's not something that I've delved into, although I was pretty close I was trying to look at the placebo effect and the perception of control, which is not spirituality. It's just saying, if you believe something, whether it's true or not, what happens to the brain? Where in the brain does that happen? How far down in sensory experience does it modify, in physiology? How powerful is a belief? It was really what I wanted to look at. But I never made it down that road. I got, kind of waylaid in some synchronous event that we can talk about at some point. And, but it makes me think, what skepticism would I have come to? How would I have dealt with that? And so when I read your work and think about how far you've gone with it and how many people are following it and using it as guidance for their work or for their practice, what skepticism do you? I don't want to sit here and critique work. I'd have to, go through it with a fine-tooth comb and say something constructive and meaningful. But I'm just curious.
Welcome. The skeptic's important. The skeptic fuels the internship.
I'm just curious. What have you come up against, and how have you respond to that? How does it make you feel? And
so from scientists, good scientists, I've gotten almost no pushback. So the findings state what the findings state.
Yeah, sure.
Right. From people who never ever read the articles, like aren't scientists, there's, all sorts of opinions. But, so for instance, when we published in JAMA Psychiatry, the cortical thickness associated with sustained spiritual life, and in particular, the strengthening of the brain in the regions that weren't thick but thin in people with recurrent major depression, suggesting developmental depression is our awakening and we're built for it, right? It went through 3 rounds of peer review, top scientists. Science put the good housekeeping seal on it. It's a good piece of science. There were 3,000 comments on, I think it was covered, it might have been the New York Times, it was something, right? And of the 3,000, I read as many as I could. I could only find 2 that had read the article.
It's classic.
But there was lots of opinion.
Yeah, of course.
Which is taste and appetite. I do think that at very least, when we have our findings, can we interpret the constellation of findings through the lens of multiple ontologies? From a view of radical materialism, we interpret the findings to mean the brain made this up. From the view of inherent transcendent quality in life, we interpret this to be the brain is connecting into the transcendent reality. Could there be, at very least, multiple ontologies used in the interpretation section, or at very least, a statement of the assumptive ontology in the scientist, that they are not more objective because they're radical materialists. They need to state their ontology. So that to me seems very fair and transparent. There is, in most of the clinical science, the interpretation section doesn't go there. And as you say, it's the interpretation section. There are now finally studies in the past, there's some that are quite old, but in the past 20 years, there's been a burgeoning that really go head on to explore the possibility of a consciousness field as foundational to reality. Consciousness-based reality, one term is post-materialism, by which is meant really post-radical, exclusive, monolithic materialism. And here's a beautiful study. This is my favorite. So Achterhoff brought indigenous healers from the island of Hawaii into the MRI. And the patient on whom they were working was in a separate MRI at a distance. And time again, as the healer did his or her, or their work, a consistent pattern came up on the fMRI of the healer. Within an instant, at a distance, down the hall in the next building, the same pattern was seen in the fMRI of the patient. 2 things, the same pattern, one thing, the same pattern in 2 places, right? Now, one interpretation of that, which I do not find a very big leap at all, is that the healer is impacting in some way the patient, that they are concomitantly showing the same pattern.
Sending some pheromones down the hallway?
Well, it could be down the street, too.
Which wouldn't make sense, right?
So it opens up curiosity for one thing, consciousness in 2 places. One thing, intention, healing process, spirit, whatever
but
one's
this is
word
not the default mode. This is not the relaxing, resting brain.
Right. This is not breathe and relax.
And they've had no contact previously to that, or were they known to each other? The healer.
That is an excellent question. In the article, it does not say whether they'd met before.
Okay.
But at that instant,
The fact that
the
it's
patient,
temporally linked is...
Right.
Yeah, and the patient doesn't know when the healer started, right?
Right.
So it's the type of study that's starting to open the door on a consciousness-based reality, and that we are built, well, put it this way, that the brain certainly can construct, right? Like the 20th century view of a factory. We can make thoughts and create thoughts. But it may also be that the brain is, by way of metaphor, like an antenna, and we can
intuitive.
receive consciousness or spirit from the field of life. And the notion that the brain is also an antenna opens us up to the possibility that all information is available in the universe. And there are times where we simply know. And it even opens up the door that is there this great source in the universe with which we are in dialogue.
Yeah, I think if you would have asked me, if I was alive and like this age 30 years ago, I would have been way more skeptical about it than I am now. I'm still a little bit skeptical. I mean, I'd love to believe that. but a little bit skeptical. But the difference between, I think, today and 30 years ago, to me, is the advent of the iPhone, right? The idea that basically it's like you have consciousness, all of human consciousness in your hand to a certain degree, right? Where people upload their knowledge onto this device all over the world, and then you can just pull from that knowledge and from those experiences. You can watch it, you can hear it, right? You can read it, and then you can use it to benefit yourself. Certainly that, there's materials involved and whatnot, but, now that we're in that context, I don't see, what you mentioned being completely out of the realm of possibility.
I would even say that Gen Z is implicitly consciousness-based in post-material. They did not grow up with telephone lines. The idea that information had to move along a telephone line to get from here to there is not the metaphor that imprinted their mind. But that the iPhone pulls information out of the air, that there is a landing pad, and then within us, a neurodocking station that can receive information that is not materially proximal.
Yeah, but that's super interesting, right? Because they're implicitly experiencing potentially this level of consciousness, but at the same time, they're having this mental crisis secondary to, what you're saying is this lack of spirituality. Like, they're having the experience of consciousness even more so than humans have ever had in their entire lives, but at the same time, they're having such a lack of spirituality. To me, that says, initial reaction is, that's weird. Next reaction is, well, maybe that means that there's this like huge opportunity, right?
Yes.
For spirituality.
Yes.
For them to just understand spirituality at a much deeper level than you would have 30 years ago.
Beautiful. I totally agree. That, Gen Z is so exquisitely sensitive and perceptive and so able to receive and perceive. Can we as educators and parents walk by their side with full respect for their own journey and ask, would you like to try a prayer, a meditation? And increasingly campuses are doing this to strengthen the authority of knowing of your inner life, that your inner life is hard data. There's hard data that we can see externally through empiricism, and there's hard data that we can receive internally. It's another form of knowing, intuition, transcendent awareness, mystical perception. So when we can support the reality of the experience of consciousness in Gen Z, give it a language, give it practice, give it integration, then there's tremendous opportunity for this generation. The passion for human rights, for animal rights, for walking the walk of spiritual values is all there in Gen Z. They're a magnificent generation, and yet the experience, the inner life of ultimate reality and its implications for how I talk to the person next to me, that is something that we need to support on campus. There is, I think, actually, spoon-fed to much of Gen Z is a theory of life that all your problems are out there. Point your finger, the problem's out there. It's someone different than you, who thinks different than you, that has a red or a blue jersey. It's out there. Well, or the world, this narrative, the world has never been so hard. Poor Gen Z, they're entering a world that's never suffered more. My grandparents, your doctors, my great uncle who lived in LA, he did surgeries on the beaches of Normandy. I don't think that was an easier walk than COVID. The world was at war. No. I don't think that the problem's out there. I think there's tremendous fragility internally, and we can support Gen Z because they are so exquisitely sensitive and gifted and so full of possibility to realize the hard knowing, the true radical shift in orientation that the inner life is real, and then bring that to the outer life. Because if we are, as we know through our inner life, in your beautiful Rumi poem, we are cut of one cloth, we are part of one sea of life, white caps on one ocean, then it does not matter whether the person in my class is a Democrat or a Republican. They are a soul on earth. They are an emanation, like a ray from the sun. They are a child of God, Hashem, Allah, the universe. And that felt sense of relational spirituality, maybe they'll even show up at our council.
Yeah, maybe.
Let me, I wanted just to come back to the science of this thing. the other thing that I thought about when trying to study this myself was, why do I have the need to measure it? I mean, it's common sense. Our mind is powerful, and to show it on an MRI somehow doesn't make it more real. Maybe I compel a few people, and then we can use our, mental powers for good, or realize that we might be beating ourselves up in ways that are destructive. But I wonder the same thing with spirituality. Why do we need to measure it at all? It's kind of common sense that, having this connection to an unconditional love that will always be there, whether you're good or bad, whether you make mistakes or succeed, that has to be. It's just common sense that it's protective. Why do we need to measure it? Why doesn't it not become real unless we measure it?
Beautiful. So one reason that measuring it has been helpful is that it has allowed for institutional transformation and a shift in how we understand the whole person. So, in aggregate, whether we're looking, at hundreds of peer review articles, it is now normative in mental health to know that a strong personal spirituality indeed is protective against recurrence of depression, is a source of resilience going through the window of risk, that developmental depression can be a knock at the door for spiritual awakening in adulthood, in midlife, in elderhood. So this is grounds in a world that still is pretty rooted in materialism of evidence to make institutional change. The second reason that I think the data is meaningful is that it is a form of witness, and it is jaw-droppingly awesome how we are built as spiritual beings and what that means for our possibility. So there's a sense of absolute awe when I see 80% protective against addiction going through the window of risk if we say, I turn to my higher power for guidance. I mean, we wait in our society for people to bottom out and be in AA and NA. And then finally, having lost their partner and lost their job and lost their dignity, we say, you know what? You've got to hand it over. They were built from the day they were born to be in a sustained, ongoing, transcendent relationship, handing it over every day of life. So we only give license to that voice when people are in terrible despair, addiction, trauma, a child, God forbid, dies, and we say, oh, you've got to turn to something bigger than yourself. It's only in the depths. So institutional transformation, modification of how we understand development, who we really are, and just to bear witness to this is extraordinary. There's also discoveries that we may have sensed a priori. I'll tell you one of my favorite.
Yeah.
I'll tell you two of my favorite. When we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s, this tremendous protective benefits of personal spiritual life, I turn to my higher power for guidance. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really does my higher power want me to do? This lived, felt sense of a transcendent, dynamic relationship. We saw that this was an innate capacity through the twin studies. We saw the profound protective benefits through nationally representative samples on late teens. But how do you operationalize that in a scanner? So we sat down together in partnership. So the Spirituality and Mind Body Institute at Columbia and our colleagues. I know you were in New Haven for quite a long time. So people probably you may have worked with at Yale sat down for a year. And we figured out, how do we take this item from epidemiology that we know is life-changing and operationalize it in the scanner? And so in a way that was inclusive and pluralistic and based on this universal finding, we asked people using a method that had been developed over 15 years to tell us a memory where they felt a deep transcendent relationship. And some people talked about being in the pews of their childhood church and feeling the presence of God or Jesus. And some people talked about being on Mount Rainier and feeling the force of life in the sun on the ice. But whether it was told theistically or in what might have been eco-spirituality, the dynamic of being in a deep relationship to the source, right, to ultimate source, ran the same neural correlates. And that was a beautiful moment where, whether they were Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Christian, spiritual but not religious, nature is my cathedral, all of our participants ran the same neural correlates. that held the transcendent relationship. Now, I might have intuited that, but seeing that was jaw-droppingly beautiful. There's one spiritual brain, and we all have it, which should put a hard stop to the debates and certainly to religious war over half the world. There's one spiritual brain.
That's really beautiful. And it reminds me of, I think it's Andrew Newberg and others who have studied the meditating brain and how it leaves behind, connection to the physical body during the fMRI, or I can't remember if he did PET scans during that time, but really interesting.
Let's bring it down to a practical level, though, now, right? We've been talking very high level. What would you say to someone in the throes of depression or addiction, or just anyone that wants to get involved with their own spirituality, enhancing that regardless of what their age is? Where is a good practical place to start?
Finding a circle of people with whom you can share your authentic spiritual life. It could be a circle of friends committed to the journey. It could be a faith community. It could be anywhere where you feel free to speak from your spiritual heart, so that the whisper of a hunch, those percolating little bubbles, you are authorized to take as real, give voice to, and share your story, and then hear the story of your fellow travelers. In this way, we open doors for each other. And we do this in my class at Columbia. I think it both ignites our birthright, our universal, there's one spiritual brain, we all have it, our universal spiritual awareness, and it welcomes the beautiful array. Like UCLA, Columbia is a very diverse campus, students from all over the world, and we welcome pluralism. So the students become spiritually connected in a way that is pluralistic and multilingual. I can give you an example. One student will say, when I came of age, when I became a teenager, my grandma, she tattooed me. And it linked me to my mother and my mother's mother and my mother's mother, the lineage. And another student will say, yeah, well, my grandma, she was there when I came home from school. And she'd make a snack and she listened to me. She taught me to pray. So now when I think of God, it's kind of God and my grandma all rolled up into one. And someone else will say, yeah, I got that. My grandma, she's passed, but she loves me and she walks with me. And when my back's against the wall, I can hear her in my mind's eye. And then the last student might say, I don't know about my family's faith tradition, but I know energy can never be destroyed. So yeah, that's your grandma. Each authorized in their own voice, magnificent American pluralism. And yet we know in the heart of what each other speak, because there's one spiritual heart, one spiritual brain. And that's deep connection. That's just not a nod at diversity. Oh, I'll be polite till you stop talking. That is a deep, authentic spiritual connection.
Let me maybe rabbit hole this real quick. What about people that I see a lot of people, including close friends and family members, that are angry at God? Have you? And certainly there's, because of that, I think there's a resistance to any sort of spirituality, anything like that. What would you say to someone like that?
Yes, very, very important point. So when we encounter a voice, it could be someone we love and trust, a coach, a parent, a relative. It could be a teacher, a member of the clergy, someone we love and trust. And they are effectively our torchbearer. The torch is truth, the torch is spirit, God, right? Yeah. They're only the torchbearer. They're a human being. They could be foibled a little. They could be foibled a lot. They could be harmful. But they are not the flame. They are only the torchbearer. The torchbearer has an enormous impact on a teen or a young adult. Yeah. And when the torchbearer does not walk the walk, or even worse, transgresses, there's a tendency for the young adult to cast away the flame. And healing has a lot to do with moving through directly engaging spiritual injury by cultivating a direct relationship to the flame. Our counsel practice was developed by the late Gary Weaver because he worked with court-referred boys who had been terribly abused and had then become abusers. No one wanted to work with them. Third time before the judge, they had a choice. You go to grown-up prison or you go out with Dr. Weaver into the Moab. And in the Moab, they did this practice and reconnected to source, to God, to their higher power. The second piece is just as, there's one neurodocking station through which we feel connected to God and feels the higher power's presence in our love for one another. Relational spirituality is both vertical and horizontal. What Gary Weaver did and what we can do to help people move through spiritual injury is both share a direct connection to the flame and ourselves become the type of torchbearers that do walk the walk. And that's enormously impactful because the young adult is going through a developmental surge. Takes us very seriously and should. I remember in college, I sat in the front row because I was evaluating the truth value of what each professor said by his or her own conduct. If they were snide, if they were dismissive, then I thought whatever they're saying couldn't really be true. And when they were respectful and loving and had an I-thou sense to all of us in the front and the back row, I thought, well, they're onto something. Right? So how we walk as embodiments of what we profess is tremendously transformative. And that can happen in therapy, spiritually oriented therapy. That can happen with a mentor, a guide. That can happen with a member of the clergy. It can happen with anyone devoted to sharing their path.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just want to ask, so it sounds like there's obvious practices we could name, 1,000 that might connect us more vertically and horizontally.
Yes.
That would be practical to bring into a clinical setting or, an intensive treatment program or something like that. But one that I've heard you talk about that I think correlates with spirituality is openness, that personality trait. I just, is it possible to make people more open? It's a trait, do you think of those things as somewhat more stable and more difficult to change? And so how do you get people that are either hurt or more permanently skeptical or non-believers or not open to become more open to these ideas?
So bearing witness, being open to experience. I think certainly, mindfulness meditation can bring people to the threshold through presence so that we can then be present, be open, be here, quiet the racket, quiet the anxieties, ready to cross over into spiritual awareness because we are so open. Anything that cultivates our openness allows us to witness the connections in life, to start to pick up on the confluences. Why is it of all days I get to speak to you two doctors today, here, now? Maybe there's something in our connection, in our conversation, that because it was today, time being an active variable, will be of particular meaning to a student or faculty on the campus now. It might not have been said if we had this conversation another day. So the idea that we are all sort of agents, if you will. We are like rays of the sun, agents of the source of life. And these patterns, these remarkable patterns, far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance, remarkable patterns that, how is it that you meet the person you love in all time and space? How is it that you find your calling? Or it turns out that the place where you flourish as a professional is where you find this mentor and you didn't even know they existed. These life change. Can we do a practice?
Sure. Let's do it. You did say 2, right?
2.
You said 2. Okay. All right. That's your that's your quota for today.
Okay.
I'm just kidding.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. We did as
2.
many practices as you want. Yeah.
This is 2 of 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes again. Clear out your inner space. 5 breaths. I invite you to think of a time where you wanted something so badly and you did everything to line it up. You strategized, you researched it. That red door was yours. It was an internship, a residency, a job, a promotion, a place to live. Him, her, them to say yes. You did everything right. A plus B plus C. And you lined it all up and you went for your red door. It was yours. You grabbed the handle and it stuck. And you can't believe it stuck because you've done everything right. It doesn't make sense. You might kick the door. You might be angry, in time depressed. But only because that red door is stuck. You have no choice. You shift. You'd shift 30, 60, 120 degrees. And over there is a bright yellow open door, a shiny yellow door. You might have said yellow doors don't exist or never heard of yellow doors, but on the other side of the yellow door was an internship, a residency, a job more right for you. You found a mentor who saw you for your fuller potential. You found a way of working that made you feel alive. You met someone who was a soulmate. That yellow door was not what you had wanted. It was better and better for you. And as you sit back and think about that stuck red door and the hairpin turn that took you to the wide open yellow door that has everything to do with who we are, where we are today. Was there anyone at that hairpin turn? Someone who pointed the way, gave you information, told you a story to the yellow door. It could have been someone you've known for years, a parent, a grandparent, a friend, who for the first time told you a story. It could have been someone you met for a minute at the coffee shop, a counselor, a guide. They pointed you along. They were a trail angel guiding you to the wide open yellow door that has everything to do with who you are and where you are today. And if you sit way back now, how is it that the most important parts of our lives are realized? Is it narrowly and exclusively through planning? Yes, we need to plan. Yes, we need to work. Yes, we need to research. But is life 100% controllable? Are we narrowly makers of our path? Or are we in profoundly important ways discoverers on our journey? And finally, if you sit way back, stuck red door, hairpin turn, trail angel, wide open yellow door, where in your road of life is your higher power? Is your higher power in the open yellow door and the stuck red door? Is your higher power in the trail angel and your openness to be in dialogue with this great force in and through our lives? Are we loved, held, and guided? Is it possible that you've been on a spiritual path all along? All along. And when you're ready, I invite you back. How'd you experience it?
I enjoyed it. It's always been something that I understand happened to me. So in college, I really wanted to make the D1 baseball team as a walk-on. And I thought I did everything right. I worked out all summer. I was performing really, really well. But it just didn't happen for me. And that really, really, it had that same sort of earth-shattering effect for me, right? Where it's like, hey, I'm told, if I work hard enough, if I'm disciplined enough, it'll work out. But it just didn't work out. And that's probably the most disciplined I had been up to that point. And again, it just didn't work out, and it was just earth-shattering to me. And, that led me to, instead of doing that, going on to medical school. Right? Who would have known if I would have made it and blah, blah, blah. And here I am now in front of you, and I met, my wife in residency, and my father's the one that kind of pointed me in that direction a little bit. So that really, that exercise definitely resonated with me. And I've always kind of understood that, but sitting back and actually thinking about it instead of just thinking about it in passing when I'm just standing around and not having my earphones in, I'm very appreciative for that, definitely. And then the experiences, it's not about going through the red door to me, it really wasn't even about going through the yellow door, but rather the hairpin turn and those people along the way, right? So like my dad guiding me to the yellow door, and then not even going through it, but then what was on the other side of that, and this whole journey through these doors and these constant hairpin turns. I talked with a very smart guy. His name's Brad Stolberg. And he basically compared, life isn't necessarily, what you actually achieve. It's like little trinkets you leave behind for people to remember you by.
Yep.
And then he also compared life to a river, right? A river isn't just like A to B, right? It's constantly forming itself through the terrain as it moves through, towards its endpoint, right? Which you usually don't typically see. You usually just see the turning and winding of the actual river itself, and you appreciate it for that, for what it is, So, that was my takeaway from that.
The river is a wonderful.
Yeah, Brad
way-
Stolberg.
Well, and to
Check 'em
think
out.
about the spiritual path as a ride on the river.
Yeah,
That,
yeah.
Why paddle against the current when you can use your paddle in tandem with
Right,
the current?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
How did you experience?
So the story that stuck in my mind during that was actually something you were mentioning, that when I was in the research portion of my training, I had started to study the believing brain, if you will, and I really had it all planned out. I was going to start here and end there, make these publications and write a book, and it's all ready to go. And so I had these two advisors, and along the way, one left the university, and the other one just wasn't as supportive, not for my style and what I needed at the time. And so as I was deciding to stay with him or kind of switch, I, on a whim, went to this talk by a woman, Lisa Feldman Barrett, at the time at BC, and was fascinated by the talk. Approached her, said, "Come down to BC. Let's talk a little more." So I went there. We had what was an interview of sorts. Showed me around, and I left walking down the campus of BC, down this huge hill, and I'm just kind of in deep thought and contemplation, kind of staring up towards a lamppost and see this red-tailed hawk, which at the time I had been seeing more and more, who had two birds in its talons, one in each. And it couldn't land and eat unless it let go of one.
Wow.
And so it let go of one, and that bird darted away. It landed on the light post with its one, and then proceeded to snack on the other, to kind of seize that opportunity. And I said, I guess my decision's made. And the rest was history. I went under Lisa's mentorship and got introduced to the other mentors of my PhD, and took a complete turn from my work into amygdala circuitry and affect and emotion regulation, all kinds of other fun stuff that I enjoyed and kind of shaped me and made me capable of doing what I'm doing today.
The red hawk,
The red-tailed hawk.
is that a synchronicity?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can understand the definition, and I was always open. I'm an open person.
Yes.
And I maybe innate or both, I think that's how I was brought up. But I loved seeing things like that. I loved looking for things like that, believing that there was some wisdom that I could follow, and might be in a person or some natural thing. But this was as clear as day. I mean, I couldn't have made the story up. And I remember going back to my apartment and telling all my buddies, I'm like, look, this, I guess my decision's made. This was unbelievable.
Deep human sense says the decision's made.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
Far too improbabilistic to have happened by chance.
Yeah.
Exquisite. The guidance is.
Yeah.
So we're all actors,
Yeah.
fellow human beings and fellow living beings. And I've shared with you synchronicities that have come through fellow living beings.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. I think we're out of time. You got a flight to catch.
This has been amazing.
You got a flight
Thank
to
you.
catch. Yes,
It's
thank
so
you.
fantastic to connect so deeply with you both.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Thank you so much. It was an honor. It was a pleasure on my behalf. I think you're onto something here. Definitely. And I know it probably doesn't mean much coming from me, but I think 82% neuroprotection against suicide is enough to get me on board.
And let's go back to the beautiful Rumi quote, right? We are a point and we are a wave. We are the ocean in a drop, right?
Yeah.
That's our capacity to know and perceive that is inborn in every one of us. It's the parietal, putting in and out hard boundaries.
Sure.
Rumi brought voice to that which we are all prepared to know. And Rumi's a guide. Rumi's the 2/3 embrace that can help us along.
Yeah.
But this is our natural awakened brain, and every one of us has it.
Sure. Thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for the book. I'm already thanking you. I don't even know if this is for me. Is this for me?
There's one for each of you.
Oh, okay. I figured since you brought two. So thank you so much for the book. I've already listened to pretty much all of it on audiobook, but reading it might be a different experience, so I'll try that too. Thank you for everything you've done with your entire career thus far. I hope to start implementing some spirituality into my own clinical practice. I deal a lot with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, people with depression, people with a lot of mental illness. So I'll be sure to start doing that. And I hope that others will too. Hopefully, I know you're working with the military. I'd love to be able to see that incorporated into the military and maybe even into the classroom in the future. I know you've mentioned that too. So again, thank you so much. I'm so honored to have spoken to you, to have had those two experiences with you. Thank you. And hopefully we can do this again.
I look forward to that.
Yeah. Do you have any last words, buddy?
No, this was just a real honor, and I think my dad's going to be jealous that I spent this much time with you. He's a huge fan.
You send both your fathers my very best.
Yeah, we'll do.
Good men from good fathers.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. This is the BrainSPORT Podcast. Stay safe, be well, and maybe even be spiritual. Have a good one.
Beautiful.
Cool.